This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Sam Tecle, who teaches in the Department of Sociology at Toronto Metropolitan University. His research engages with Black and diaspora studies, urban studies, and sociology of education, with particular focus on the analysis of diverse experiences, trajectories, and expressions of Blackness, grounded in particular histories of racialization, colonialism, community formation, and resistance. In this conversation, we discuss the early formative history of Black studies in Canada, the roots of Black study epistemologies in everyday practice, and the complexity of diverse stories of Blackness for the Black studies imagination. Good afternoon, Sam. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm super happy we have this time to talk. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast for a number of reasons. I want to hear your perspective on Black studies and how you think about your research and pedagogy in relation to it, all those kinds of questions, how you imagine the field. But as a sort of particular thing that I'm excited about having you on the podcast is you're adding to what is growing and will hopefully continue to grow, which is the non-U.S. perspective on the field of Black studies. You know, being a scholar in Canada, which I know has a very different story, but also very similar story about Black studies and its meaning and its place in academic and political life. So having that perspective and expanding non-Canadian listeners and scholars and students, expanding our sense of what the Black studies imagination can do from the Canadian perspective is huge, and just adding to an appreciation for the kind of work you all are doing. So that's a long way of just saying, really, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Really excited to hear what you have to say.
And I've been listening as much as I can leading up to this, so I'm really happy and kind of honored to be included in this conversation and to be in the very great company of many of the thinkers you've had on. So I'll do my best to show out for what we do.
My collaborators and I, Ashley, she and I created the podcast. We never imagined this sort of expansive vision and just sheer number of people and the excitement of all kinds of scholars, activists, and artists to be on the podcast. So it's been a pretty phenomenal archive every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So when you say I've been listening, it's pretty hard to keep up with, I think. It's like a full-time job to keep up with. So, But we'll have a chance to talk about your how you understand the field of Black studies, that sort of portrait you work with, especially in the Canadian context, and also about your research in relation to it. But I wanted to start with the more personal question, just to ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, this really interesting question along with that, which is, what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
This is such an interesting question for me now, writing through book proposals and negotiating with publishers, and very much you begin to think about one's own journey into the intellectual space.
Mm-hmm.
And in looking back, I think my own interests and curiosities, even desires and dreams, really come from the fact that I come into this world both Black and from East Africa. So I'm coming from parents who are Eritrean, which is a small country right beside Ethiopia, and parents who were born in a struggle to birth this country. So there was a long war and a history of a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia that lasted over 3 decades. And my own introduction to politics, to analysis, to resistance and struggle comes from my parents and my understanding of how we got to this place, to Canada, coming out of a place of struggle, strife, difficult life, and self-determination, political expression. So I think I my own current book project and thinking comes from that reality, right? Coming from a people that had to struggle to exist for independence, but also for self-expression in a particular kind of way. I think that's part of my Black studies journey. Coming to Toronto in the early 90s, landing in a place called Jane and Finch, which is this really this area of the city that's poor, it's working class, it's imagined to be black, scary, don't go zone, no go zone. So I really kind of, it's really, and I write in my Jane and Finch book project that it represented American urban decay for a white public, a white Canadian public. So I also come, I come up in the world, both Eritrean, black, and growing up in this kind of stigmatized, poor, working class area that had a lot of fight. It had a lot of struggle. So ever since I was 12, we were grappling with the ideas of how we were seen in this community, right? And the ways in which we wanted to change the image of Jane and Finch or struggle for resources, the way in which we were left off the political agenda. So I learned organizing, political organizing, translating. I learned multiculturalism and diversity, living in a public housing building that had folks from South America, from all parts of Africa, that had poor white people from Eastern Canada, and we were all somehow making do and making things work, and grappling with what I would now call city structural issues, structural neglect, underfunding of public housing. So I think my Black studies journey, in looking back, it really started with those two historical traditions, right? Of, what happens when a set of people are fighting for independence, self-expression, the right to speak their language, to build what they understood in that form of freedom was to have a country, to have an independent country, some sort of self-expression. And then growing up in an area where a bunch of people were doing that in this place called Toronto in Jane and Finch, I think those really make up, and it's that make up my entry point into Black studies. And then Black studies later on, when I'm entering into undergrad or even in grad school, and the way in which I would say Black studies was smuggled into my courses or my course of study, or many times in the student groups that I populated in my undergrad at York University, and this was no joke, in the Black student group, in the Eritrean student group, the Ethiopian student group, the East African student group, the African studies students group. So I was in all of these places, and I look back now yearning for a particular kind of Black studies, right? So that's how Black studies, before we had formal departments, programs, certificates, or minors in our institutions now, which we fought and struggled for. I think that's where many of my contemporaries or colleagues now who are professors in other institutions, that's where we both found, smuggled, and made Black studies, right? And a lot of us have this history of being from Caribbean resistance backgrounds, or we're first generation in many ways attached to a generation, a parent's generation, or a parent's struggle for a country, for self-expression, for the journey to make it to this place, which we were told was filled with milk and honey and a good life, and all the ways in which our studies indicated perhaps this has not been the case. So I think coming up and studying, both coming of age and then intellectually in Canadian post-secondary institutions, we very much kind of made our own Black studies study circles in, I guess what Moten and Harney would call the undercommons. We're like in and around and under the university. And then they gave us the tools to try to make more and more spaces where we could do the kinds of analysis that we wanted to on the lives that we deemed were worthy of this analysis, that sometimes our mainstream degree programs didn't think so. So I would say that I think that's my journey into Black studies, both a kind of informal, through background, through a history of, tradition of resistance and struggle, and then into like more formal institutions of study, where we kind of had to do it on the side of our desk, we would say now, or under and around the university in subversive spaces.
So first of all, thank you for that. It's there's so much we could talk about. I just want to pick up on a couple of things. First of all, I just want to say that York University is really, really well represented on this podcast.
Oh,
I think we've had people who teach at York University, Natasha Henry Dixon. It's not out yet. It'll be out about the time that yours comes out. Bianca Beauchemin. And like Juanita Stephen, who did her PhD at York, but teaches, So this York seems to be a place where some incredible stuff is happening. So I love that. I just want to sort of like mention that, like give York, not necessarily the institution due, but something that's going on at York.
And what's so funny you say that, we would go and present at conferences. Many of the folks you mentioned, and Chevy, who's out at Dow now.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah. He's on the podcast too.
Yeah, we would go and do these presentations, and then folks would say, look at all the amazing things, amazing Black studies or things that's happening at York. And then we would be like, yeah, but this is very much in and against the institution, So many times we would ask the institution for resources because we would be getting so much recognition or shine or light on the work that we were doing. So people read that as, look at the way in which the institution is supporting this. And intellectual innovation, forefront of scholarship, but very much so we were doing this at many times, as Stuart Hall might say, in and against the institution, because this was the kind of work they didn't formally support.
Yeah, I can imagine that piss you off a little bit for York to get all the credit, a bunch of credit for the thing that you did.
But it's also,
but the people of York is really it's always a different thing.
Right? You kind of understand when Hall would write, I was in the university, but I wasn't of it. But it's such a normative read to read, these 4 people are from York University. Like the institution must be supporting them. Look what the institution made or has helped support. Yeah. And then the experience inside the institution is so divergent of that. You just, and I think that's a very Black studies, perhaps, reading is we must have this kind of very layered and complex reading of the kind of work that was made possible, sometimes despite the institution.
Yeah, I mean, that relationship between the institution and the kinds of Black studies that you're talking about is really interesting. And as well as, you said formal and informal, that was a really interesting turn of phrase for me, because it's like when I was listening to you talk, I'd actually been sort of playing with form and inform as you were talking, just as as a active listener or whatever. But I was like, it's such a form of life that you were describing in terms of both a country of origin, Eritrea, and a place of origin, right? In this particular neighborhood that has a particular kind of political or social meaning and resonance. Those are complete forms of life and practices, as you said, and I think really articulated well, of Black studies just in the act of survival, the act of living in a particular kind of diverse space, but also that informal, if you want to call it that, also form of life of all these groups at the university, right? Which I love that it wasn't just like the Black Student Union, right? It was all, you listed off like 5 or 6, African, I think you said, I may have said East African, but
there were all
Ethiopian,
those spaces, and I got Black Student Union too, on top of all that. Yeah.
And I know sometimes that can get fraught, especially, 18 to 22-year-olds, especially who, I was one of those at some point in my life many years ago. And lots of things are fraught. But I think that the fraughtness of those kinds of spaces is actually where a lot of interesting Black studies insight can come from, right?
Yeah.
Tensions, arguments, disputes, but also collaboration, solidarity, shared identity. And I love these being places that you have identified as Black studies because, as you mentioned, Harney and Moten, but also, I was going to say it, and then you said it. I loved it. That's actually Black studies, is always to be working in this place of the margins, in this place of whether it's under common or underground, or in but not of, in these kinds of things. Yeah.
No, 100%. 100%. I just would quickly say, I think some of those discussions that animated those conversations with then us PhD or PhD candidates or master students were a lot of times more stimulating than our course programs, our department, our programs. And now, like for me and my Black Grammars project, it's animating the content of the material for book projects, for articles. So those discussions and spaces that were made in many ways sustained us to survive, to finish our sociology PhDs or our political science PhDs, or our, some folks who are in like interdisciplinary course programs, social political thought, that didn't have at the time formal places for us to study the Black radical historical tradition, Black popular culture, cultural studies. And those conversations are still debates that we see now that are existing in Black studies, right? So the auspices of those student groups were interesting and like were intellectual hefty enough to sustain us even now in these projects. So all that to say that even these might be even seen as somewhat trivial, but looking back, we wonder, oh, we were doing some things. We were on the forefront of some things, now the journals want some of these ideas, and so do some of these presses. So,
I love that. I mean, there's lots of ways, I've sort of followed or had the last part of the first question, right? What sustains you in relation to this work? Often what sustains is a sense of like, I'm doing something meaningful.
Yeah.
Also, in these groups, like the emotional and spiritual support that comes, and that stuff is all really real. And without it, I don't know that Black studies could survive. But I love this other dimension you've unlocked about sustain. It's like sustain's a research project, right? It's like, I still have ideas after my dissertation.
Yeah.
I still have ideas, and they don't come from reading post-dissertation. They come from this deep root in the field and practice of Black study.
Yeah. And I think Joshua Myers, in his text of Black study, there's something to know and be known about knowing Black people, studying and knowing what Black people do. So a lot of my work too is community facing and comes from being in concert, in community, in political work with other Black folks, and trying to think through deeply what it is that they do, whether it's political expression, cultural expression, community organizing, even making joy, surviving, analyzing, all of what happens. I try to understand what is at play here. What are these folks doing, and what are the ways they're playing with ideas like history, truth, capital T truth, playing with politics. So I also find being connected to, like, whether it's my East African community, Black political community in the city, being in concert and playing in sites of joy and leisure with other Black and other racialized folks, I find that to be quite sustaining, like literally quite sustaining, life sustaining, but also with the kinds of questions I get, right? So there's a scene, and just to give a quick short example, there's a scene in Black Grammars that I've written up that has made it through the dissertation into the manuscript, that speaks to my experience getting a haircut in Jane and Finch and going to a barbershop that has all like Rasta barbers, so Caribbean, Jamaican, mostly Rastafarian barbers, and them telling me about the history of Ethiopia, right? From a son of two people who fought for independence from Ethiopia, who is Eritrean, and them like holding Ethiopia in a particular kind of light. I call it the Black diasporic's North Star, freedom of North Star. In the imagination, Ethiopia is really like the place that's never been colonized, and then me going home and hearing very different ideas about history of the Horn of Africa. Very different.
I imagine that's put mildly.
Yeah. So there's a particular, and there was, and then I went to get another haircut because I was so thirsty for the knowledge. And then the story was a little bit different. And then I realized, oh, this is not capital T truth. There's something else happening here, a kind of performance, a kind of playing with politics. And I said, okay, let me try to make sense of what's happening in this barbershop. And that was almost a kind of my first introduction to Black cultural diasporic politics. Right. And I'm just here trying to get a haircut. So it was it's things like those kinds of scenes that I pay attention to that tell me something about what's happening when Black people from different places settle in one place and get together. Yeah. So
I love that. I can't wait to read that.
Yeah. So I mean, because those barbers, they were not, and they are still not involved or invested in capital T truth. But what they're doing is doing some kind of work. Right? It might be freedom making work, freedom dreaming work. It's a certain kind of imagination that's at play. And I think that's fascinating. Then I think there's a particular kind of reading that needs to take place to participate in that culture, right? One can go there and say, tell me your references, show me your historical references, triangulate your findings. That's not what's happening here, right?
No.
It's another kind of toasting, as Caribbean culture would call it. It's a kind of exaggeration. There's something in the performance. There's something improvised about it. Every time you go, it's a little bit different. There's something in the telling, right? So those are the ways in which those things sustain me too. Yeah, and I like the way that, and we could talk about this. I think it may come up later. There's a way in which I realized that is also has always been part of what Black studies is, right? And how do we maintain that? while still fighting for a particular kind of institutionalized Black studies. And I think we're grappling with those kinds of questions specifically in Canada, where we are in our Black studies in institutional journeys, because we're really at the beginning.
Yeah. So let me just follow up then on that last comment, and just before I ask it, actually, I can't wait to read that. I've like a real interest in how to grapple with sort of what I think about is like political memory that is not one's own.
Yeah.
But is oriented toward the future. So there's like a weird time and identity and geography, and it's not just like, oh, here's one example of it. Like you said, it's just like this permeates all of these spaces, and it's important. It's not where's your sources, and thinking about it in a productive way. So all to say, like, get all this stuff out so we can no pressure.
That's the plan. That's the plan.
That is the plan. But that last thing, that being Black studies being in its sort of early stages in Canada, I want to hear you talk. I mean, in some ways you've already answered this question, but hear you talk very specifically about that. Like, what is that portrait of the field of Black studies in a Canadian context you work with? Because I think, the U.S. context is so informed by the tensions at its founding, a commitment to a certain liberatory politics, but also a commitment to an intellectual tradition, right? And that intellectual tradition has very deep roots in the early 19th century to the present, if not before. And that tension between a political commitment and intellectual life, I think the tension between that is part of the Black studies imagination in the United States and was there at its founding. And I'm interested to hear, like, how you see the emergence of Black studies in Canada, and what's that portrait that really animates or orients you in thinking about the present and future of the field?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question, especially for all of us to be thinking about in what we're doing or trying to do here. So that like era of those of us who came out of grad school, finished our PhDs, and are professors now, or assistant professors, juniors in the scholar in the field, are those of us who were at our institutions. And just to use where I did my PhD at York, we were Black PhD candidates in varied departments who found that we had to find each other to find both intellectual camaraderie and fellowship, and to finish in our individual departments. But we also had to make some kind of body to push for resources to get finished. And what we found we were all doing was a kind of Black studies without formal title, right? Or as CLR James might say, no, not a formal banner. So we were doing Black studies work, and then while advocating for resources for Black graduate students and PhD candidates specifically, to make sure that we finished, did not become a certain kind of statistic, but then also maybe leave something behind. So we began advocating and pushing for resources for ourselves to get done, to intellectually survive and finish, but then also for a certain kind of formal recognition of the work we were doing under what we would call Black studies, Black Canadian studies. And so now that we're maybe 5 to 7 years removed from that point. And now we're seeing that these institutions have begun mounting Black studies minors, certificates, programs, departments, and in some cases even degree granting, full degree granting status. And we are now assistant professors in those departments being tasked with like supporting or mounting or making sure that these programs sustain. So all that to say that I think I would imagine to say that is on the backs of many scholars before us who have laid groundworks, right? So all the folks who are our supervisors, the Ronaldo Walcott, Catherine McKittrick, Carl James, who was my supervisor, all of these Black scholars who were pushing for these before they could say or even demand a certain kind of Black studies. Andrea Davis, who's no longer at York but was at York. All of these scholars were doing this kind of work that were modulated differently in for their political context. So I think we're now at the point where many of us perhaps are feeling like we're tied up in the outcome or how these things do. How Black studies certificates, programs, minors end up are also aligned with the beginning of our intellectual careers in the field. So many of us, I was hired at TMU to provide courses to teach courses in the Black studies minor. So I have an investment in the minor, and I think that's important. I think all of us do. but it's quite a shift from the being the rambunctious PhD candidates who were getting, a little bit out of line, out of pocket, demanding meetings with presidents, the president of the institution, with vice provosts, with our departments, to now being the assistant professors who are in those departments with newly born Black Studies certificates and programs and minors. So I think that shift is I didn't think it's quite a drastic one for us to be thinking about what our role in those moments are. Because for me, Black Studies still is tied to freedom. As we mentioned, it's tied to liberation. It's tied to, like I said, hearing the stories at my parents' feet about fighting for a country for 30 years, resistance, armed struggle, getting in the lobby of my public housing building and arguing and trying to politically organize for a city that ignores us in the Northwest, ignores poor people, ignores racialized poor people, working class people. How do we get the city or the province to look at us? I'm tying my own intellectual investment with Black Studies in those struggles and struggles for freedom. Because when I started reading in the Black radical tradition and the Black histories of struggle, I said, oh, these folks were fighting for these things all the time since the late 1800s, and I'm finding parallels in all of those struggles, right? So I think about how we can maintain that impulse, that desire for freedom inside these new formal, institutionalized, at least Black Studies in name spaces, right? I'm very interested in that. I think I'm still working out, and I imagine many of my counterparts and colleagues, many with whom you've spoken to, are working out what's our political role in this, our role as juniors in the field, tied up with questions of livelihood and longevity, with a public that was, I think, and a government political climate that was very interested in Black life 5 years ago, or 6 years ago now, in 2020, as maybe all of our governments were. And what do we do perhaps with that interest, both institutional, resource, funding, political, is waning, I think. Yeah. And I imagine how many of us might feel, or how many of us, would feel that our intellectual and professional journeys might be judged alongside how these departments, certificates, or minors do in a political context, with a fading commitment to Black life. I mean, some folks say DEI, but Black life, right?
Mm-hmm. So, thank you for that. It's incredibly interesting, and it's also, with a number of things interesting listening to that. People are going to have a lot to think about with what you said and reflect on. It is interesting. I mean, Black Studies in the United States is was so much generated as an institutional formation by student protest and demands, and it is interesting for you to talk about the demand and fulfilling that demand in some ways being carried by the youngest professors. And that's a lot, because as you said, that means it's not, I came with a sort of prestigious career and look what I did with that. Instead, it's like, as I'm making my career, as I'm writing my books or articles and teaching my classes, I'm also building this history that somebody will look back on. And when you were talking about that flip of sides, and I've said this quoted this on the podcast a number of times, and in my life all the time, my late dear friend and colleague Jeff Ferguson, when I got tenured and promoted, we shared an office, and I walked in, and he was like, had some like wine or something, like celebrate, and he toasted me, and he said, "Welcome to being a part of the problem."
Yeah.
And I was like, and I laughed because talk shit to each other, and I was just like, man, why do you got to take all the like joy out of this?
Yeah.
I was being playful, but he said, no. It's what kind of problem are you going to be? You're a part of the problem, because they can't fire you. So if you're a problem to the things that want to suppress the very idea of the study of Black life, they can't fire you for that.
Yeah.
It's like, you could be that problem, or you could be the problem where you get written about in the history of, fucking
Yeah.
everything up.
Yeah. No,
But
it's amazing. That's awesome.
and so it's like, you become a part of the problem. Now you're in the institution, you're designing the programs, and what about the student demands and these interstitial or marginal lives? But you can also be that problem that makes their problems into a flourishing space.
Yeah.
And a problem for the institution, but that's so much to ask of your generation of scholars, but also incredibly exciting.
Yeah, I think it's an
From the outside.
Yeah.
I'm not in the middle of it.
No, I totally, I think I'm aligned with that. Leslie Sanders, who's a professor of humanities and a really important architect in the history of Black studies in Canada, at least, who's a white woman and was on my committee, but also a vital tower in Black studies in Canada. I remember our conversations, and she's like a literature person, a theater person, and there's a line in Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. It says, "How does it feel to be a problem?" Right? And we argued to her about who is Du Bois addressing in this statement, in this remark. And I in your latter reading, it's like, oh, I like being the problem. I think it feels good to be a problem for, European conceptions of the human, or European, or canonical ideas of what knowledge is. Because Black people fuck all that shit up, right? And a lot of racialized and minoritized people do. So if we can make, and that's part of, I think, what Black studies helps me do, is if I can make, or us look at these unexpected and unforeseen places for what intellectual work it does, like the barbershop, or like this, what should be a benign intersection in Toronto, Jane and Finch, but does so much work in the white Canadian imagination of what it represents for Blackness and urban and poor and scary neighborhood. If I can make us look there and then say, look, these things, these places, and these people have much to teach us, then it feels good to be a problem. And I want to continue to maintain to be a problem, because what happens if we're no longer a problem? That is, to me, much scarier, right? And I also want to say that there are many in these institutions that many of our cohort of junior faculty, there are Black professors, like I said, who have been in the grind, who have been in the institution, and are also part of the mechanics of what it's meaning to install these Black Studies program certificates and minors, right, into these places, but also makes for very intriguing, perhaps we could call them generational debates about what directions some of these program certificates and minors should go, right? Because I remember having conversations with Black faculty, tenured, associate, full professors who are, mounting the Black Studies minor at my institution, and then hearing things honestly, it can't, the Black Studies minor can't be that radical. It can never be radical, Sam. And I'm like, oh, what Black Studies are we talking about? Which history? Which, what? And then, even the kind of speakers I imagined for a Black Studies speaker series, some of the folks I proposed, oh, this person's untouchable. We're just starting in the minor. Maybe we'll make waves later. So these kinds of things. And I think those are fine. I think those are healthy. And I think, at least in my studies of different insurgent knowledges in the university, are entirely par for the course. This is kind of what's supposed to happen. So I do want to mention too that there are Black faculty and allies and supporters in these institutions who are much more adept at understanding the administrative ridiculousness that comes with working in a university, and are much more adept at getting things done.
That's important mentorship
that support us.
Right there.
But I also do think that a lot of us junior faculty do feel like, I wonder if my fate and how I might be looked at is tied up with how this minor, this program, this certificate does.
Yeah. To your, when you said it's par for the course, or I forget that, I don't know if you use that phrase, but for there to be conflicts at the heart of something, like formation of a department, or cultivation in this case of a minor. I mean, that's how traditions always work, right? Traditions work with really savage debates about everybody before me is stupid and I'm the only right one, and we will all play that role as we age. When we're young, we're the right, and when we're old, we're the wrong. But I think understanding that wider view, I like we'll put that, it is par for the course, and accepting that maybe takes some of the edge off of some of those conflicts, but we are human beings. And so,
yeah.
Well, let me ask about, and this is specifically about your work in Black Studies and your disciplinary training as a graduate student in sociology. Because the way you've described your research and sort of how it expands some of these ways of talking about the field and Black studies, but also talking about Black life, it's been really interesting. And I'm interested to hear how you think about the relationship between your PhD being in sociology and your work, both inside and outside the classroom, inside the classroom and in your research, being Black studies. And so, that's a movement between discipline and non-discipline.
Yeah.
So I'm interested how you think that movement has shaped, your disciplinary training, but also the life after that and before that, how that animates how you think about and conceive a research project, but also maybe how you create and sustain a classroom.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think for me, the best way for me, I think, to probably answer this question is to share the story, I guess, of my PhD project's evolution, I think. So we, like all PhD programs, we write these proposals. We kind of pitch it to a department when you apply, say, this is all the ways that I'm smart, this is my transcript, and this is my project. So my project, again, informed by my own background and lineage and, tradition and where I come from, was looking at Eritrean and Ethiopian diasporas in Toronto, in London, in the UK, and in places like Washington, where they're in big numbers, and Chicago. So looking at what are the ways in which these folks have grappled with questions of Blackness, right? This is basically the thrust of the project. I went to these different places. I was going to talk with some folks, really just get to hang out and hopefully have the institution pay for it was my plan. And then I remember going in through the PhD training, going through, and then when you really get serious about crafting your proposal, applying for grants and funding. And I remember the sociology professors supporting me. And remember, we're all in the same team. They want you to win. They want you to get the funding, win the grant, because it helps make the department look good. And they read my project and read it like this. They said, oh, so you want to study how Eritrean and Ethiopians come to these cities, struggle with settling, questions of race and racism, what are the kinds of discrimination they faced, what are the difficulty with jobs. And then I was like, oh, in my head, no, I don't think that's my project. I don't think that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do and see what are the ways in which they grapple with questions of Blackness with other Black folks. I wanted to see how they grappled with their background and a kind of really Americanized, heliocentric conception of American Blackness, right? So, because people from the Horn do something to the history of Blackness as we understand it that is informed by the Caribbean, by the American kind of history of slavery and enslavement, right? But my project was only legible to the institution or the discipline of sociology if it was like a settlement, and this is all the ways that these particular Black folks deal with race and racism and discrimination. And I remember I struggled for that for almost 3 to 4 years of being able to articulate, oh, no, that's not what I want to do. For me, it was, I'm not interested in questions of race and racism, even if that's how sociology views Black people. And I know Ronaldo has a paper on this, and this goes back to that Du Bois quote, how does it feel to be a problem? The way in which Black folks exists in sociology proper is as a problem to be studied, meticulously prodded. These are the ways you deal with racism. Okay, fine, yeah, you guys organize. That might be interesting, but look at all the ways in which you guys don't get jobs. Social underclass. This is how bad your housing is. This is where you live, right? But when I acquired and began to convene with other Black graduate students, Black PhD candidates, and we began to read in Black studies, I began to better be able to articulate a different program of study, which Black studies gave me the language for. I was really interested in the way in which these diasporas had an impact on Blackness and the way in which the conversations changed when they entered Black spaces. So like the barbershop, right? Or if we, wanted to understand the way in which these diasporas from the Horn are looked at in a different kind of way by Black diasporas from other places, right? Or the way in which in Chocolate City in DC, where a bunch of folks from the Horn of Africa came, really kind of changed the way and a certain area of Ethiopia, Little Ethiopia or Chocolate City was looked at. They wanted to change the name to Little Ethiopia, and the way in which that caused a certain kind of cultural debate in DC about Chocolate City and the history of Chocolate City and what this diaspora or this renaming might do. So I'm interested. I became, I needed the language of Black studies to articulate a project that wanted to look at the way in which Black sociality was altered or changed or politics got discussed because diasporas from the Horn came into these spaces. And that had nothing to do with race and racism and settlement and structural racism and systemic racism and the tools by which that diaspora became legible in sociology. Like that was and honestly, in those, what was most illuminating was the way in which those professors were really telling me, this is the way you get funding in sociology. Read your project like this or write your project like this. And then it dawned on me that I was not interested in doing a disciplinary sociology project in the way in which Black people have always shown up in sociology projects, right? And even Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, I think, it plays with this, right? When she's writing Du Bois, doing surveys in like the Ninth Ward, does something. The critique that I'm making, Saidiya Hartman does it, of course, in a much more creative and intelligent and brilliant way, but is making the same kind of critique about normative research, capital R, capital S, sociology research. So all that to say is, I Black Studies gave me the language to articulate a project that pushed back against that kind of normative reading, right? And then I do that. That's what I try to do in my classes, whether I'm teaching a really urban studies sociology course on Toronto, which I teach, or the Black popular culture course, or even the hip hop course, which I just finished teaching today, is to say, look at all of these sites of Black life, whether it's the street as socialization, the barbershop, or it's artists making videos in the Louvre. There's a way in which Black artists make us do intellectual work that doesn't often get read as intellectual. Whether it's in the ghetto, the gutter, the gully, wherever it is happening, I can show you the ways that Black artists, Black youth, Black culture makers can teach us the same things that we learn in our academic texts, in our journals. And that's the fun. That's how I smuggle or sneak in Black studies and to students who then begin to see all the ways that Black cultural life or Black art becomes a site of intellectual inquiry, right? Yeah. Because that's when Black studies opened up for me, was when I was saying, oh, that what was happening in that barbershop when you were 12 years old, just trying to get a haircut and trying to get a word in with some of these Rastas who are telling me about like 400 years of history in very creative and remixed ways, that was a particular kind of intellectual work. Like that can show up in the monograph, right? And that means then that what's happening on the corner can, what's happening in public housing can, and that to me is actually very intellectually stimulating, right? Because it's the same kind of intellectual work, or it's the aunties in their women's circle when they're meeting up, and here we have this very big phenomenon where our Somali uncles and dads meet up in coffee shops and they do political work. They talk politics, and they will buy their one coffee and sit in that place for 7 hours and talking politics. And these are the places where a particular kind of intellectual Black studies work that's happening. And I'm so excited or interested in how I write that up. How do we represent what's happening there, right? Yeah.
I love that. Thank you. I mean, that was such a brilliant explanation, or not explanation, but account of sort of disciplinary, post-disciplinary ways of approaching Black life. I really love that. And where you ended there, which is really this way that Black studies makes it possible for the entire world to be an archive. Not out of just creative embellishment, but out of actual appreciation for where intellectual work is done. Whether it's with, turns of phrase, whether it's coffee shop and, the barber shop or beauty salon. So I love that. That's what you just said is this all by itself is just a fantastic contribution to this series. And I just have two more questions for you. One is, and this is, I know the youth of the Canadian context, it's a little bit of a complicated question, but what do you think Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not or is not doing particularly well?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think too. I guess in this moment of it's like intellectual evolution of Black Studies, at least in Canada, I'm really interested in the ways in which how we maintain an eye on a critical attention to community in a critical complex way, because there's a way in which institutionalization makes us turn to the institution almost exclusively, and I'm very hesitant and nervous about that, about where all of the Black life that happens, especially in a month like February, Black History Month, where there's going to be so much almost like uncritical perhaps, but celebratory sites for Black life that get read outside of the institution or of Black Studies. But I want to know, how do we maintain and sustain and still have a kind of reciprocal relationship to what's happening outside the institution, right? And not get too caught up with what might be a fleeting investment from the institution, right? So I think that's important. That's something for me to think about. And I think what are the ways in which Black Studies might continue to have a wide angle, a wide lens vision on what happens in the places that I've mentioned, in the places that are non-middle class, non-elite, that are messy, political. And I talk about this in my Black popular culture course. And I remember coming up with folks like Mark Campbell, who's another amazing Black Studies scholar here at U of T Scarborough. I remember auditing his class again. There was not he was teaching an undergrad Black popular culture course, and I was a grad student. And I was like, can I just come and sit in? And then realizing that the readings that we were dealing with were all like really in the vein of like what we might call like pieces that were of high cultural standing. So like really good pieces of Black art that we would consider like almost in like the Matthew Arnold, like the best of what's been said and other. But I was also like thinking about like, I don't know if our students are really only watching or seeing those things on their screen, right? So now in my Black popular culture course, I really want students to read the foundational stuff on Black popular culture. But then I'm like, if you're watching Pop the Balloon or Baddies, which are these like really reality, Black reality, really popular shows and engagements. And, you know, I don't know if many scholars would go and say this is the best of what we've made. But if that's what they're watching, I want to understand, how is it that you're taking these tenets of Black cultural criticism, of Black popular culture, of being a cultural studies scholar, and putting it to these questions of these things that might not be considered worthwhile art to do that. And how do we have space for that? Because Black popular culture, Black studies has always vied for intellectual credibility, right? So you grapple, like it's probably easy, not easy, but it's understandable to write many papers on Sinners, the film Sinners, and all the ways it's doing what it's doing. And it's amazing work. But I wonder if we paid that same kind of attention to some of these other cultural productions, what does Black studies look like? Or Black popular culture, you know what I mean? So I think about that. That's a nagging thing for me too, because Black studies should also pay attention to the range of the stuff that we make, right? So those are some of the things, the way in which institutionalization of Black studies might pull our lens and our attention and our investment, our energy and our material beings and time away from community, which a lot of scholars, Black and non-Black, have spent time doing. But what happens when the institution is doing Black studies? Does that pull our attention, our resources away from what's happening in community and the ways in which we've shown up there? And then also a Black studies that pays attention to all of the things that we make, even if it's some of the stuff we don't want to put all the way up on front stage. Yeah, you know, and I'm interested in that.
So I always love intro podcast occasions. I would just mention here, Melissa, it's a very early podcast in the series, the conversation I had with Melissa Daniels Rauderkus, where she talks about in her book, her first book was on really the canon of African American literature.
Okay.
But then her book she's working on now is on what she calls the hood novel. She's like, what would it mean to sort of take her, for her, it's like take my literary reading sensibilities to these novels that actually teenage girls are reading in the 90s. Right.
Yeah.
And, there's so much out there in it. And it, on the one hand, I think it requires a different sensibility, but on the other hand, it gets directly, as you've articulated so well, gets really to the heart of the foundational sensibility of Black studies, which is an attention to community, which is not just we have our ideas, let's go be activists. It's also like what is going on in common spaces that can be a part of common intellectual life. I appreciate the way you put that. Yeah.
No, that means you might have to grapple with Sister Soldier then. That'd be interesting to read.
That's what that's the sort of like the, what do you call it? Like the grounding text for her.
Yeah.
Oh, so, that's the important thing. So, it's a great podcast too. Melissa's brilliant. So last question for you, in a sort of thinking in the context of Black studies, study of Black life, what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about? What's a question you would want us to all be asking?
Yeah. I mean, in this moment, I would imagine, what are the ways in which we envision, like, what do we want Black studies to look like in the future? I think is an interesting question for me. And this might be, who echoes in my mind a lot these days is Stuart Hall. And there's the line, I forget which paper it is, but he says something like, if cultural studies, and let's say if Black studies, is not a site where we can imagine a socialist, a collective, a certain kind of future, then I don't want anything to do with it. You know what I mean? Can we? Is there a no-go zone for us, perhaps, in this kind of institutionalizing moment, especially for Black Canadian studies, where we might see, does this still serve us in a certain kind of way for a certain kind of freedom, liberation that's global, that has all of us, that doesn't dispose of anybody, that isn't neat, it isn't tidy, it's messy, especially in moments of fascism and genocide. Yeah. All of the emails with, you're on these, you're trying to write, and as Sylvia Winter told Catherine McKittrick, just get tenure. I get all these emails from folks who I just have professional email relationships with, and all of them start the same. Like, hey, Sam, how are you doing in these perilous, chaotic, catastrophic times? Oh, by the way, do you have the latest draft? You're like, this world, it's a crazy world to live in. And then to be concerned
email is a real thesaurus for catastrophe these days. And
really, right?
I get the same
intro
it's
like, hey, did you finish reviewing that article? Can you get this? And I'm like, yeah, we're living in fascist genocidal times. Yeah. So all that to say is, does Black studies have something collective for us that we can use to respond to this moment politically from the university? I'm really interested in that question. And I think now is the time where we can really push the margins. Yeah. Because it's new. It's still forming. It's still a baby. So I think those are the kinds of questions. I mean, that's the most pressing things for us now. Is this, and honestly, I think many intellectuals who are very much invested in a different kind of world, is this where we should be spending most of our time? Really? Right? Like, I know, of course, it's a job, it's a livelihood, but like, is this where we should be doing it? And then, Ronaldo Walcott in his latest work asks, like, what are we willing to risk for that world? Right? And does Black studies give us a space to think about that and provide something of a kind of answer for that? So I think that's the kind of questions that a lot of us, at least the folks that came up with me into this intellectual vocation, I think that's the kinds of questions we're asking of and with inside Black studies in this moment.
I love that. Thank you for that. That's such a fantastic and provocative and thoughtful and really urgent place for us to wrap up. I was looking forward to this for all the reasons I said at the beginning, and this conversation has just been amazing. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, your insight, and sharing both your time and words with the podcast. So, thank you for all of that, and just know I appreciate it, and listeners are going to really love this conversation. It'll take away a lot to think about.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too. You as well. Have fun teaching.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.